This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Meetinghouse today, where we have conversation on religion and American life. And I am your host, Dwight A. Moody. With news, 5 stories from Orlando, Florida, Owensboro, Kentucky, Washington, D.C., Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Tallahassee, Florida. All of the news brought to you by PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. You can visit their website and order some coffee. My guest today is scholar, professor, pastor, author, activist, Dr. David Wheeler of Portland, Oregon. I'm playing a conversation that we had back at the 1st of June, one of the best from this past year. We talk about climate change, the doctrine of creation, and what Christians, individuals, and congregations can do to address the climate issues. But first, the news brought to you by Perfecto Coffee. From Orlando, Florida, the Holy Land Experience. It's a Christian-based theme park in Orlando, Florida. Their property has been purchased by a Seventh-day Adventist healthcare company for $32 million. Trinity Broadcasting Network bought the 15-acre museum and Bible-themed tourist attraction in 2007 for $37 million. The healthcare company, also known as Advent Health, was founded by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, quote, to extend the healing ministry of Christ, end quote, according to its IRS filings. The Holy Land Experience, 3.5 miles up the road from Universal Studios, Florida, was struggling to survive even before it closed its door on March the 14th, 2020, in response to the COVID pandemic. Advent Healthcare intends to repurpose the property and the buildings. I'll have to confess, I visited this Holy Land Experience once. I've been to Israel many times, going again next year if you'd like to go, leaving toward the end of May, coming back in June, 16 days in Israel and Egypt, 3 days in Egypt. I've been to the Holy Land Experience and thought it was kind of cheesy. I'm not surprised it has struggled. We'll see what the Seventh-day Adventists do with this property. From Washington, D.C., a story about a person who doesn't get much attention. Johnny Young was a career diplomat in the state service of the United States and in retirement led the Roman Catholic Bishops' Refugee Service. He has died at the age of 81. During his career with the U.S. Foreign Service, Young served as ambassador to Sierra Leone under the first President Bush, as ambassador to Togo and Bahrain under President Clinton, and to Slovenia for President George W. Bush. Born in 1940, Young was raised in deep poverty in Savannah, Georgia. After the death of his mother, he was raised by his Aunt Lucille, who joined the Catholic Church after serving as a domestic at the Basilica of St. John in Savannah. Young graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia. He was the author of a book entitled From the Projects to the Palace, A Diplomat's Unlikely Journey from the Bottom to the Top. This is a great story. I've never done a story on him. I'd never even heard of him until the notice of his death came around. He would have been a good person to interview in the Meetinghouse. And From Grand Rapids, Michigan, Charisma Magazine and website founder Stephen Strang will join the platform party in Grand Rapids at the Reawaken America tour of Pentecostal evangelist Clay Clark. Strang is the author of the recent book, God and Cancel Culture: Stand Strong Before It's Too Late. It is part of a Christian subculture in the United States that is pushing back against many social trends, including the racial reconciliation and social justice movement associated with Black Lives Matter. In another episode of this, writing before a tent crusade in Sacramento, Pentecostal evangelist Mario Murillo asserts, quote, God is fiercely warring to restore what America was before the poison of wokeness entered her veins, end quote. Now, I publicize these stories because I've been following for some time now the Pentecostal subculture with its emphasis on prophecy, especially that was related to President Trump in 2015, 16, and 2020. But also because it is at the center of the pushback against the COVID and the vaccine and the mask wearing and all the restrictions. And now it's a pushback against these social movements related to racial justice. I think it's a very important story in American religious life, one that does not get the attention that it needs. In Tallahassee, the fight over COVID and the protocols for public health have found their way again into the matter of church and state. Last year, numerous churches filed court cases claiming restrictions on worship violated their freedom of religion. Some went all the way to the Supreme Court, you remember. Now, Florida education officials are offering tax-funded vouchers to parents of public school children who do not want their children educated in spaces where public health protocols are in place. The vouchers will enable these parents to send their children to private, often religious schools where such protocols are rejected as an infringement on, yes, freedom of religion. So this means that discrimination based on a willingness or not to adhere to public health protocols justifies the use of state tax dollars for private religious schools. Things in Florida just keep getting weirder and weirder, as well as sicker and sicker, and more deadly and more deadly. It's hard to discern what's going on down there in the minds of the governor and his staff, pushing back against all protocols, squelching local efforts to address the pandemic. We'll keep you posted. And then in Owensboro, Kentucky, where I was this past Sunday, Third Baptist Church in Owensboro, Kentucky celebrated anniversary number 125. I was there. The church was founded in 1896 in a split with Owensboro's First Baptist Church, following the preaching of Methodist evangelist Sam Jones, especially against the use of alcohol. That's a long and interesting story. At its founding, the church was the largest white Baptist church in Kentucky, with 2,500 people crowding its then new sanctuary for the sanctuary's dedication in 1909. Famous and influential Pastor J. Frank Norris, who died in 1952, claimed a life-changing experience while preaching a revival at Third. That was 2010. During the ministry of Pastor H.B. Coonley, 1946 to 1958, more than 3,000 people joined the church in an 11-year period. That's remarkable. But now the downtown church has experienced steady decline, beginning before Dr. Coonley left in 1956. It's now struggling to survive with a congregation of about 200 or fewer souls trying to care for a massive downtown structure. I was there and I preached the morning sermon. You can find that sermon on the website at themeetinghouse.net. It is entitled The Church We Have. That's a reflection of the curiosity I've had over the last several months, my postings on Facebook, articles I've written entitled The Church We Need. But I preached this sermon entitled The Church We Have about that great church and my experience with it. You can read that on the website. I think I'm going to post it on Facebook shortly. Third Baptist Church in Owensboro is like a lot of churches. Large structures, grand history, proud memories, but an uncertain future. We'll keep you posted on that and the trends. That's all the news, sponsored by Perfecto Coffee of California. You can order your own coffee, perfectocoffeeinc.com. You're listening to The Meeting House, and I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming over Rejoice Radio in the Golden Isles of Georgia and through the television network of St. Stephen's Baptist Church of Louisville, Kentucky. I'll be back in just a minute with my conversation from June the 3rd with author, scholar, activist, professor, pastor, and a friend of mine, Dr. David Wheeler of Portland, Oregon. You're in the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. My guest is David Wheeler, coming all the way from Portland, Oregon. He didn't start out in Portland, Oregon. He's from Kentucky, like I am. He's a graduate of Georgetown College, like I am. Earned his MDiv from Yale Divinity School and his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in California. He's been the pastor of churches, the First Baptist Church of Los Angeles and then the First Baptist Church of Portland, and now teaching with Palmer Seminary out of Philadelphia. David, it's great to have you in the Meeting House to talk about this. I want to read back to you something that you wrote, and I quote, "At a time when the world is on fire and the web of life is fraying, the theology and ethics of creation care constitute the most important issue, emphasis yours, facing followers of Jesus and the Church of Jesus Christ," end quote. That's a pretty strong statement.
Well, it is a challenging claim, and I get pushback all the time. As you mentioned in the intro, I've been teaching theology and ethics pretty much continuously for 35 years, and I've stayed in touch with a lot of my former students over the years. And just the other day, I was on a Zoom call with a former student of mine, an African-American student who has founded a very strong, socially justice-oriented ministry in Virginia. And he wanted me to come and talk to his colleagues, but he said, not about that. We've got more important things to deal with, speaking with issues of issues such as racial justice and economic justice. So it is a big claim. And Dwight, you and I were raised in an environment where we weren't worried about that either. We were worried about being left behind. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. So how and why do I justify that claim? I'll tell you what I said to this student of mine. Every issue that moves us, that in some cases is an issue of life and death, such as our responses to racism, our responses to pervasive economic inequality, the pro-life movement, protecting life in utero, that's so important for a lot of evangelical Christians. None of those issues can be sustained in the long run, can be challenged or worked on in the long run if we don't have a livable world. It's as simple as that.
As a matter of fact, the issue of our livable world is not just about Christian ethics, it's about human ethics, and it's a thing that should pull people together from all over the world.
Well, I would say that there is no human ethics without what I would call an ecological ethics. It's not that we live in ecosystems, we are ecosystem. From the literally trillions of microorganisms that live in our bodies, we're their universe, that sustain our digestion, that sustain our neural reactions, to the global ecosystem, to this universe, which we as Christians say is God's creation. All of these levels of reality are bound together. And as Christians, we believe God created them, God cares for them, and we can only do ethics in the context of the systems, natural and social, of which we're a part, the systems that we are.
And you know, as a theologian and a Bible teacher and a pastor, that the Bible begins with a strong statement about creation, the two creation stories in the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, one of the more famous quotable lines in Holy Scripture. But it also ends with a great vision of creation with the New Jerusalem, the river of life, the tree of life, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. And these two visions at the beginning and at the end of the Bible kind of bind the whole Judeo-Christian narrative in a way that emphasizes their importance in our understanding of the world and our understanding of human life.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, in direct contradiction to the left behind theology that so many of us grew up with, I would say that in Scripture, from beginning to end, as you've implied, there is a sense of God's care for, there's a sense of direct continuity between this life and all of its flourishing and its complexity and whatever comes beyond. You know, I sometimes try to go out and sit under a tree and just think about eternity, what my concerns would be, what my perceptions would be. And finally, it's just too much. I dissolve into wonder. But Holy Scripture does show a direct continuity between this creation and whatever is to come. The creation, the entire creation, is to be renewed, transformed, purified. The sin that has infected it is to be overcome. And in that vision, which you mentioned at the end of Scripture, Revelation chapter 22, I spent a lot of time in the back country, sleeping under the stars, listening for bears in the camp. So that's part of my experience. But actually, I'm an urban kind of guy. And I've lived in cities like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and now Portland. The vision in Revelation 22 is an urban vision, redeemed humanity living in a transformed city.
Yes.
But it's also an ecological vision. There's a river running through that city with a tree of life growing on either side of the river. And it's what ecologists call a riparian ecosystem. The shade of the trees is shelter for the birds, keeps the water cool, so the crawdads and the turtles can live in the water. So consistently from Isaiah 11 to Isaiah 42 to Psalm 104 to Revelation 22, the outcome of God's creative and redemptive work is a transformed and perfected world, not just redeemed people.
Yes, I appreciate you drawing attention to the urban vision of Revelation. Many times our dominant image of the world, God's world, is drawn from Genesis 1, where there is a garden, and Psalm 23, where you have the shepherd and the sheep out in the pasture. But the concluding vision of the Scriptures is this of the city with walls and streets and the river that flows through it. I want to go back and comment. You mentioned that you and I grew up in the Left Behind time of Hal Lindsey back in the 70s, and you are right. All of that was so dominant. But it's not just our generation. The millennial generation grew up in these with these 11 novels of not Hal Lindsey, but
Tim LaHaye.
Tim LaHaye, who made $1 billion at least on all of these books and movies, the Left Behind series. So this idea of we're leaving behind this world still is a dominant idea in Christian imagination that we have to resist and respond to.
Well, my response is, if we read the scriptures with discernment, the consummation, both in its urban imagery and in its natural imagery, the peaceable kingdom, the lions and the lambs and the bears and the little children and all of that, it's all a transformation and a perfection of what God made in the beginning. And I would just say, as a practical aside, one of the issues that I have worked with on with my current students, many of them living in places like Quito, Ecuador, and Cochabamba, Bolivia, and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, they're on the front lines of the climate crisis. Well, we are here on the West Coast too. Raging wildfires are in Texas, that incredible freeze that left millions powerless. Mm-hmm. But every day, my students are dealing with droughts and hurricanes and destruction of rainforest environments, but they can respond with urban gardens, as many of them do. Cities are ecosystems as well. My wife and I and our cat love to watch the squirrels frolicking in our urban ecosystem and the many kinds of birds. Some of my students live in places like rural Mexico, the Oaxaca area, where they're working on sustainable agriculture as a Christian ministry, an outreach of the church, a support of the church's people and the community's people, and an expression of their Christian faith.
Well, I'm glad you brought up this kind of global feel, as you are involved in a global network. I want to read something else that you wrote and ask you about it. And I quote, "Wars over scarce resources produce millions of refugees and fuel xenophobia in the countries to which these refugees flee. All of these displaced millions are at least partially climate refugees." Mm-hmm. Wow, that is a great phrase. So unpack this a little bit more for us. Climate refugees.
Well, let me unpack it by talking about something of which we're all aware, and it's been a major issue for conservative politicians and conservative religionists in the United States, and that's all the folks flocking on our southern border. Now, many of them are coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and they are coming because the traditional agriculture in these regions no longer works. I remember my first trip to Central America in 1992, and I was coming in. Carol and I went to San Salvador and Santa Ana. I was invited to teach in the Baptist seminary there. We were coming into the San Salvador airport, and the hills looked like a dog with mange. Mm. The traditional forest cover had been eroded and eroded as subsistence farmers crept further up the hillsides because the fertile valleys were taken over by cash crops, things like coffee and sugarcane. Well, that's only been exacerbated in the almost 30 years since then. And so folks can't live in the traditional subsistence farming in small communities, so they flock into the cities where there's overpopulation, there is crime, there are gangs and drug dealing. And so literally to save their lives, many of them come north, knowing the risk that they're undertaking, and they pile up on our borders and create a political crisis, which in many cases is exploited for partisan gain. Some of my students in Baja California, particularly Tijuana, have over the last several years responded graciously, responded in a Matthew 25 way to Haitian immigrants. The last huge earthquake was in 2010. They still not overcome the effects of that. Since then, there have been successive hurricanes. And so there are climate justice, climate refugees in Baja California, and Mexican Baptists are receiving them, sheltering them, helping them seek legal status, find jobs, and educate their children. But this is only going to get bigger.
Only going to get bigger and worse. And it's not just Baptists who are manning these camps where these refugees are coming to. It's actually a ministry that has connected many Christian and non-Christian groups. Yes. It's a humanitarian initiative to try to address it. I had never thought of them as climate refugees. But because we think of, well, they're trying to get away from the drugs and the guns. But your description of it kind of reshapes my awareness of what is driving a great deal of this mass movement, this migration of people from Central America to North America. You lay out in an article the way Christians, and I guess we would extend that to even non-Christians, kind of a threefold strategy for what we can do. You know, when you think about what in the world can we do about hurricanes and floods and, you know, this sort of thing, those generally are considered beyond the scope of human impact or human influence. But you lay out these three things. I want to read them off and then let you we'll dialogue about them one at a time. Number one, a serious commitment to a lifestyle of simplicity, as you say, is modeled by Jesus. Second, a reevaluation of dominion theology. Now we'll have to describe for our listeners and hearers what dominion theology is. And third, a reexamination of the scope of beloved community, to use a phrase that was very popular with Martin Luther King Jr. So let's go back to this simplicity. What do you mean by a lifestyle of simplicity?
Well, we in the United States, and American Christians have often been at the forefront of this, have developed a lifestyle of comfort and luxury and a very large carbon footprint, a phrase that's become popular, a very large footprint on the earth. And we have seen this comfort and this prosperity as signs of God's favor.
You know, I want to comment about this. Everywhere you go in America, in urban environments, in rural environments, in the mountains, on the coast, the one thing that you find that kind of signals this are these storage units. People rent these storage units. I've done it several times in my life to store all their stuff and things, right? Mm-hmm. It's consumption.
Well, so I would like to imagine an economy that is less and less based on the production and consumption of stuff, and more based on the things we grow, write, sing, dance, cook, weave, more and more based on the productions of our minds and hearts, living in community like Shane Claiborne and the Simple Cooperative. Shane is a graduate of Eastern University, Palmer Seminary. When you and I were younger, we were aware of the beginnings of the Sojourners community with Jim Wallace and colleagues.
Right.
I would like to imagine an economy based more on the interchange of these human products. Now, that would be a big shift in our national and global economy, but we could live well in this way, and we would mirror the life of not just Jesus, but in the life of the Jerusalem church in Acts chapters 2 through 5, having things in common. Now they were waiting for the imminent return of Jesus. I like to say these last 2,000 years and counting have all been the last days. If you look at it in the context of cosmic history, 14, 15 billion light years, give or take. So that's the idea that I have of simplicity. And I think local churches, by sharing resources and sharing their space. As a pastor, I've tried to encourage my congregations to make their properties meeting houses, not just for worship and for traditional potluck fellowship, but meeting houses for education, for medical clinics, for community meals, for activities with children, preschools, all sorts of things.
Well, you know, this is the long history of meeting houses in the United States. I think of the Old South Meeting House in Boston, which was not only a gathering for worshiping people, but the center of planning for the American Revolution right there in the Old South Meeting House. And many of the meeting houses, especially those in Boston, were also stops on the Underground Railroad, so that the intersection of worship and justice have been central to the idea of the meeting house for a long time. And of course, that's where we get the name of this program, inspired by just the type of community you're describing, Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, Shaker Village, where they lived in community, lived very simply. The only thing that they failed to do in order to sustain their was to procreate. You know, they didn't believe in sexual activity between people, and they died out. So,
well, this lifestyle of which I'm talking is a very embodied lifestyle.
It is. It is.
We can eat well, we can dance well, we can love well, and we can carry that over into the life everlasting, where Jesus, in a grumpy moment, said, don't worry about whose wife she'll be, talking about
the resurrection.
The woman who had married and outlived 7 husbands in the kingdom of heaven. It's not like that. And I take it that it's not a diminishment of the love and intimacy that we experience on earth, but a multiplication and enrichment of that love and intimacy in ways which are almost unimaginable for us here and now. But that's a whole other topic.
That's a whole other topic. That could be a month of topics in the meeting house. So let's talk about this number 2, a dramatic reevaluation of dominion theology. First, explain to our watchers and our audience, what is dominion theology?
Okay. It comes straight out of the first Genesis creation story.
It does.
Where God creates the first humans, male and female, in God's own image and likeness, which I take it to mean reason, aesthetic appreciation, a moral discernment, language, those kinds of things. And then God invites us to, in the old King James, have dominion over the rest of God's creation, over the beasts of the field and all of the denizens of the earth. The idea, though, is not a kind of lordship and exploitation, as it has come to mean in many cases for Protestant Christians in particular, evangelical Christians in particular, but it's a caring for, it's a stewardship. We are, in the second Genesis creation story in particular, God's gardeners. And so Jesus talks about being Lord and Master, yes, but the one who is Lord of all must be servant of all. So the true dominion is a caring for, a taking care of, a promotion of the flourishing of all God's creation. So it's not exploit. The infamous Secretary of the Interior at one point during the Reagan administration who said, God gave it to us, all the oil, all the gas, all the timber, let's use it while we're here. No, it's a theology, if we understand Genesis correctly, of caring for and enhancing and blessing the rest of God's creation into which we're set as God's gardeners, God's caretakers.
Well, this certainly, this reevaluation of dominion theology is certainly a place where pastors, preachers, teachers, professors like yourself, and even radio hosts like myself can help to articulate this older and newer interpretation of that great Genesis text, to have dominion over things as a caregiver rather than as a consumer, I suppose.
I would even say, Dwight, a partner or a colleague. There's a sense in which, for instance, in the organic farming movement, which you can read about in books like The Omnivore's Dilemma, those organic farmers understand that they are in community with the plants and animals that they care for, and even especially the butchering of the hog is a sacramental act, and we give thanks to God as we use what God has given us through the hog, through the chicken, or through the ear of corn.
The third part of your strategy here, I want to read what you've written about it. Quote, pervasive breakdowns in the global climate, and you list invasive species, the poisoning of the air and the water, desertification. Did I pronounce that right? Desertification?
Well, I would say desertification, but
either way, pandemics are intrinsically related to a failure to exercise dominion properly. This reality must lead us to a reimagination of the scope of beloved community. So let's take that phrase, beloved community. Gosh, was it Howard Thurman who really introduced this into modern Christian dialogue?
Well, in my consciousness, and perhaps yours, as you alluded to earlier, it was popularized by Martin Luther King Jr. I think it was originated by Josiah Royce, a Christian philosopher who was associated with Yale and worked at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But it's a biblical idea in the sense that God calls us to community. God creates us in community, calls us to restore community. Jesus famously talks in Matthew 25 about blessing and caring for the least of these. The vision of the peaceable kingdom in Isaiah 11 is human beings and other parts of God's creation living together in harmony. So for King, beloved community was black, brown, white Americans, and in the latter stages of his too brief career, the nations living together, blessing one another, making peace together. But I would say beloved community includes all of the elements of God's creation in the wonderful imagery of the Methodist Christian ethicist J. McDaniel. It's the finned ones, the rooted ones, the four-footed ones, the winged ones. And I've added, in my own thinking, the tiny ones, the microorganisms in our guts, the thousands of tiny arthropods and fungal cells and algae that live in the soil and help the tree roots communicate with one another. Beloved community includes all of that. As I said earlier, it's not just that we live in ecosystems, we are ecosystem. And we cannot flourish if the ecosystems are not whole.
Well, dear Pastor, I have to make a confession here. One of the things that I do occasionally is watch videos on YouTube. And one of the more fascinating categories of YouTubes are from the animal kingdom, watching the various species struggle to eat one another. There's a whole series of these videos about the resurgence of the bald eagles and how they are attacking pets, cats and dogs and rabbits and that sort of thing. There's lots of these videos of huge snakes that struggle with alligators and other kinds of animals. So you have this built into the essence of life on planet Earth. I'm going to eat you before you eat me. How do we resolve this with this idea of the beloved community?
Well, let me take a short detour, and it will be short, by citing Andrew Lindsay, a British Christian ethicist whose most famous book is called Animal Theology.
Really?
And Lindsay believes that he's a very sophisticated fellow, but he believes that the fall literally brought about carnivores and herbivores and predation. I don't know what he does with fossil evidence for hundreds of millions of years of dinosaurs and coelacanths and all of that. But and he takes Isaiah 11 literally, and that somehow the digestive system and the dentadure of the lions and the bears will be changed so that they too will be herbivores.
But then again, herbivores, your vision.
Well, herbivores also, some of the folks who are really into plants now.
That's right.
Believe that they can perceive the hara cries of the grass as it's getting mown down by the bison.
But in your own vision, the ecology includes not just animals, but plants. And so whether we're eating other animals or eating plants, it's I'm going to eat you before you eat me type of thing.
Well, here's the thing. Our human bodies, our animal bodies are in an unlimited cycle of redistribution. Literally, every living thing on Earth is stardust, because there is no element heavier than helium that is created in the normal thermonuclear fusion of stars. Anything heavier than helium, atomic number 2, is created in the unimaginably dense and hot interior of stars, and it's only liberated when stars blow up in what we I'm missing the word right now, supernova. When stars blow up in supernova, all the iron and the silicon and the oxygen and the nitrogen that is the basis of ecosystems gets blown out into the universe. And the Earth was seeded with star guts. And so everything that is alive on planet Earth and anywhere else in God's cosmos that is where there's life, it's recycled stardust. And so my body is from the Earth, it goes to the Earth, and somehow in God, in the unimaginable nature of the life everlasting, the recycling will take a form that is harmonious and acceptable, and can I even imagine not painful? There's a famous short story by Dostoevsky called The Bear, where a man is out in the forest and he finds himself being preyed upon by a bear. And when the initial horror subsides, he gives himself to the bear's embrace because he knows that this is the way of all the earth. The Lakota on the Great Plains prayed to the spirit of the bison before they went hunting, and words something like this: your children will nourish my children. They ate the flesh. They made clothing from the hides. They made thread and needles from the bones and the sinews. And the prayer continues. And then my children will return to the earth to nourish the grass that feeds your children. Now, there is a way of understanding this that can transcend the horror and just trust God to make it beautiful and make it peaceful. That's kind of mystical, but that's the best I can do.
Well, they certainly weren't teaching that in the seminary when I went to school 50 years ago, but listening to you talk reminds me of Wendell Berry and what he's tried to do there in our home state of Kentucky, and has risen to great fame and influence because of it. David, I want to thank you for stirring us up today and talking about all of this. We began by talking about how is it possible with everything else that's on our mind: pandemics, race relations, abortion, power struggles, politics, poverty, eating, the struggle to get the attention of the decision makers. Some of them are politicians, and some are artists, and some are scholars, and some are scientists, and some are parents. But it's a real, as you started out with your story about your student over in Virginia, people are so focused on other things that it's hard to get them motivated to address any of these three practical steps that you have laid out. We'll have to come back and talk about it again. David, thank you for your work, for your long ministry, for your ongoing ministry. May God give you many good years. You're a very articulate spokesman of your vision and the vision of others. Thank you for coming into the Meeting House today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and God willing, we can have further conversations down the road.
We sure will. You've been in the Meeting House with me, your host, Dwight A. Moody, on this fine August morning, listening to a conversation recorded on June the 3rd earlier this summer. I encourage you to visit our website at themeetinghouse.net. There you'll find all the commentaries, book reviews, and podcasts of many, many interviews that I've had on religion and American life. I invite you to join our Circle of 70. This is a group of people who support the program. We have a very modest goal of raising $24,000, and you can help us do that. Go to the website at themeetinghouse.net/support, and it'll give you an address where you can mail your contribution. I want to thank my engineer, Everett Armstrong, in the studio down in the Golden Isles of Georgia, Alex Mattingly in the bluegrass state of Kentucky. Thank you for your interest. You can follow me on Twitter at Dwight A. Moody. I'm up to 424 followers. Until next week, be safe, do justice, love mercy, as the prophet says. Get a vaccine. My son just got his yesterday. It's not too late for you. Order some Perfecto coffee. Send us a donation. Pray for the soul of America. Give thanks. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.